Good afternoon and welcome to Talk to Your AWC Lobbyists. I'm Peter King, CEO of AWC, and I'm pleased to welcome city officials from all corners of the state to our live stream this afternoon. Your lobbying team will brief you on current issues here in Olympia and will ask you to take action on key priorities. As you all probably know, our annual City Action Days scheduled for yesterday and today here in Olympia was canceled. Mother Nature did not cooperate with us, and we decided to cancel the event for this year. Flights from Eastern Washington were either delayed or canceled. Snoqualmie Pass was delayed, closed for an extended period of time, and snow and ice accumulation throughout the state really made travel dangerous. So we made the decision to cancel. In fact, the legislature itself was closed here on Monday, a rather rare occurrence. For those of you who are planning on being here, we appreciate your patience and understanding. We also know that many city officials needed to be home to deal with weather emergencies. So if you couldn't be in Olympia today, we figured the next best event would be to do a live stream. As of today, we're 1 month into a 105-day session, and deadlines are looming. You will hear from your lobbyists that we do need your help. The last 15 minutes of today's 60-minute session has been set aside for questions and answers. The lobbyists will answer as many questions from you as time will permit. If you have questions, please email them to questions@awcnet.org. Let me repeat that, questions@awcnet.org. You will hear the voice of Sheila Gall, our General Counsel, posing your questions to your lobbying team. If you are viewing through LiveStream, the email is at the top of your screen during the session. With that, I would like to turn the program over to Candace Bach, Director of Government Relations here at AWC, who will get us started. Thank you for joining us, and we'll turn it over to Candace.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to our audience who's listening to us now. As many of you know, Talk to Your Lobbyist is a tradition at our City Action Days conference, and we certainly didn't want to pass up the opportunity to share this important information with our members. Let me just give you a little bit of an overview of where we're at in the legislative session at this point. As Peter mentioned, the session started on January 14th. It's a long 105-day session. The end of session is April 28th. And this is the year that they write their biennial budget. So that will be what they're turning their focus to soon, is crafting that budget. In the meantime, though, they've been addressing a number of policy bills. More than 2,000 policy bills have been introduced in this legislative session so far. And we're fast approaching some of the first deadlines for action in the legislature. On the screen, you should have a slide that highlights our 2019 session and some key deadlines. February 22nd, next Friday, is the first policy committee cutoff. That's when bills need to be out of their policy committee. Starting this week and through next week, committees will be taking what they call executive action and working in executive session. That's very different than a city council's executive session. In the legislature, executive session means when they're voting on bills. It's not done in closed session, is actually done in open session. So February 22nd is our first key cutoff date when we need to make sure that some of our key policy bills are out of committee. The next cutoff date is March 1st. That's when bills need to be out of their fiscal committees. Fiscal committees in the legislature are Senate Ways and Means, Senate Transportation, House Appropriations, and in some cases, House Finance. So that's the next key date that will be coming up. March 13th is when bills have to be out of their House of Origin. So a bill that was introduced in the House of Representatives will need to be voted on by the full body by that deadline, and or the Senate if it was a Senate bill. March 20th is a key date as well. That's when the state's next revenue forecast will come out. That likely signals when the next budget will be released. This year, the House is up first for releasing their budget proposal, followed by the Senate. Those are often timed right around when the forecast comes out, because that's when they know how much revenue they will have, as well as what the caseload forecast will be, which impacts expenditures. After that date, April 3rd is the next key cutoff date. That's when the opposite House Policy Committee cutoff occurs. April 9th is when the opposite House Fiscal Committee cutoff occurs, and April 17th is the last day for bills that are not necessary to implement the budget to be considered. So these are the cutoff dates. Of course, the legislature makes these rules and sometimes modifies these rules as they see fit. And also bills that are deemed necessary to implement the budget kind of work on their own time frame. So I wanted to share with you these key dates because we will often be asking city officials to weigh in as these dates approach so that we can see that bills that we want to move do move in advance, or bills that we'd like to stop where they're at. I also wanted to mention a few key resources where you can get more information about legislation from AWC. This year we've started our City Voice podcast, and hopefully that you've been tuning in to hear more detailed information about some of our priorities. We, of course, produce our legislative bulletin on a weekly basis, and that's an excellent source of information about where bills are at in the process and where we need your feedback and where we need you to weigh in. And finally, of course, we use social media to share some highlights and what's going on in the legislature, so please be sure to follow our social media accounts. We've also started to produce a weekly hot sheet of issues, bills that we're especially focused on at this time. And so that first hot sheet came out on Monday with the Legislative Bulletin, and we'll be talking today about bills that are included on that hot sheet. With that, I'd like to move into some of our priority bills and some of the other bills that are included on our hot sheet. The first bill I wanted to mention to you is on one of our priorities around economic development. Senate Bill 5564 is a sales tax value capture tool that we've partnered with Senator Brown to introduce. And the bill had its first hearing and has moved out of its policy committee. So as I mentioned, it's cleared that first cutoff hurdle. It's now awaiting action in the Senate Ways and Means Committee. This bill is an economic development tool that works similar to tax increment financing, but uses a sales tax credit instead of a property tax credit. The bill was amended coming out of policy committee, and that amendment shrank the fiscal impact to the state, but also limited the effectiveness of the tool. We will be working with the bill sponsor and other legislators to amend that bill back up and add some additional revenue into it, as well as eliminate some of the other pieces of the amendment that constricted the bill and made it yet less usable for cities. So we encourage you to be talking to your legislators about Senate Bill 5564. A couple of other bills I wanted to mention that are around our priority issues related to the Public Works Trust Fund are Senate Bill 5788 and House Bills 1680 and 1691. These are all somewhat related. I think most of you are aware that the Public Works Trust Fund is a critical source of infrastructure funding for cities. But over the last decade, the legislature's diverted over $1 billion out of that fund. We're seeking this session to ensure that the money that's supposed to go back into the fund, about $217 million in loan repayments and REIT funding, does stay in the fund. We are also seeking to end the diversions of REIT funding and solid waste utility tax dollars that currently are diverted out of the fund for other purposes, and we would like to bring those back in for things related to some of our other priorities. So these three bills that I mentioned, Senate Bill 5788, House Bill 1680, and House Bill 1691, do that. They end those diversions of REIT and bring those dollars back into the Public Works Trust Fund, prioritized for housing-related infrastructure and for helping local governments with culvert repairs and removing fish-blocking barriers from our culverts. So House Bill 1680 and House Bill 1691 are scheduled for hearing next week, and we are encouraging support for those bills. Finally, I'll mention House Bill 1667. This is related to public records. I think some of you are very aware that cities are required to report metrics around public records management to JLARC. That began last year. We know that some of those metrics are challenging for cities, so this bill actually streamlines some of those reporting requirements. It also removes the sunset on the state archivist grant program. That's a grant program that we successfully created and got funded in 2017, but it had a sunset date in 2020. So House Bill 1677 would remove that sunset date and make that grant program permanent. So we are encouraging the legislature to move that bill forward. With that, I would like to turn it over to Carl Schrader to talk about some bills that he's been working on.
Thank you, Candace, and nice to see everyone this afternoon, and thank you for joining the webinar. Sorry that you're not able to be here in person. So I was going to give you all an update on some of the vast variety of housing bills that are out there, talk a little bit about our approach on those, as well as some issues associated with homelessness, and I'll touch on the culvert issue again briefly. So Candace mentioned that there was, what did you say, almost 2,000 bills that had been introduced, and it's probably just me, but it feels like about half of those have been related to housing this year. It is kind of a crush of approaches coming from legislators across the political landscape. I think that many of you in your communities are facing the similar sorts of challenges. We've got a spiraling cost of single-family homes, challenging status of trying to attract development in your communities, vacancy rates that have been among the lowest in the whole country for several years now, and not just in the urban areas. Some of our more rural counties, Kittitas County, Clallam County, are under 1% vacancy rate, which is far below what it takes to start affecting rental prices. So we're seeing an interest from legislators who have never really been involved in housing issues in Olympia, introducing their own ideas, as well as a number of folks who have traditionally worked in this in this field, advancing concepts. So some of them are really good, and some of them are a little more challenging. So we're going to go through those a little bit for you. A big one that we have been supporting for several years now is the proposal from Representative June Robinson in the Everett area to create a new sales tax revenue sharing program whereby cities and counties would have the opportunity to access a portion of the state's sales tax to invest in construction or operations and maintenance or rental assistance of low-income housing. This could potentially be a very good program for cities. It's very flexible. There's, as it stands right now, no match requirement. You would just be able to opt in as a councilmanic action to receive a portion of state sales tax and help to address some critical needs in your communities. So those of you who are facing that challenge, we'd appreciate if you would reach out to your legislators and let them know how important that will be for you. Another proposal that we've pushed with the leadership of the city of Kirkland is flexibility around the use of your existing real estate excise tax for housing purposes. So this was something that we got created 4 years ago, I believe, that basically authorizes you to use REIT 2 funds for housing purposes. But when the legislature created that authority at that time, they put some pretty significant hurdles in front of your access to that authority, essentially that you would have to be able to certify that all of your other capital needs were met before you could do that. And very few cities have been able to meet that test. So this bill would eliminate the sunset and remove those barriers and basically leave that to your discretion. What is the best use of your community funds to address whatever needs you have in the infrastructure or housing space? That's House Bill 1219 and Senate Bill 5195, also both bills that are, we'd appreciate your telling your legislators how important that could be for you. We've also heard from a number of cities' interest in removing barriers to private sector development, particularly the condo liability reform efforts, where the state's laws regulating how condos are constructed and some of the liability associated with those have potentially swung the pendulum a little bit too far and made it difficult to get construction insurance for the private sector, which has led to a very low amount of condos being built around the state. So there's been an effort to rebalance that, protect consumers, but also allow the industry to move forward, that cities have been supportive of. That bill has also moved out of committee and seems to be on a pretty good path. That's Senate Bill 5334 and 1306. Another one that has been really critical to our smaller cities that's moving in the Senate right now is Senate Bill 5366, which would allow the smallest cities, which are currently precluded from offering a property tax abatement to attract multifamily development, apartment buildings. The larger cities have had this tool for years, and we hear a lot of support for its role in helping attract development that otherwise wouldn't be able to make it pencil in your city. So we think essentially at this point it's pretty arbitrary to say that smaller communities don't have access to a tool that has been very successful. And we've heard from a number of cities that are active on that. Cedar-Woolley brought this bill forward a few years ago. Chelan is working on it. We're certainly supportive of that and hope we can make progress on it again this year. Unfortunately, it's not all roses on the housing front. It's a little challenging and frustrating, frankly, as a city representative down here, that so many of these bills are predicated on the idea that, if only cities would make different decisions, consistent with what folks in Olympia think is the right approach, housing would flourish and we'd have affordability around the state. I think you all know, and we are certainly making the case, that it's a lot more complicated than that. What sort of development actually occurs in your communities is not just driven by a simple density number, but we are seeing proposals in both chambers to mandate land use from the state, to apply minimum standards, especially around transit stations, to local communities. We are opposing those efforts. We're having constructive conversations with the advocates. I think that there's a pretty good chance that we will move forward in session with a bill that provides you more tools and more choices and help to develop urban infill and redevelopment, but we're doing our best to avoid any sort of state top-down mandates. Right now, the Senate has the more preemptive approach. Senate Bill 5769 would mandate minimum densities in all cities of at least 6 units an acre, with very little recognition of why you might have a need because of critical areas or different planning objectives to have larger lots, not to mention the philosophical question of, do we really want to say the state should not have a variation in lot sizes? So we're opposed to that bill. In the House Bill 1923 is a much more optional themed approach. Its desire is to provide you tools and then more streamlined and encouragement to adopt some of these proactive housing policies. But it still has a number of challenges to it. We're opposed to it right now, but again, we are making good progress. We would appreciate your efforts to contact your legislators and explain to them that you are working on housing issues. You recognize the role that cities play. You also recognize the role that cities cannot play in developing housing, since we don't generally construct. But just encouraging them to take a more thoughtful approach on this issue could be very helpful. You know that we've worked on homelessness issues at AWC for many years. Cities are very supportive of additional resources to address the challenges of unsheltered homeless on our street, to help our police with tools to provide mental health and behavioral health support instead of incarceration as the only option for community members that we come in contact with that are in crisis situations. Unfortunately, we have a couple of bills this year that are maybe slanted a little bit too far away from that perspective from where we sit. Particularly concerning is House Bill 1591, which was recently heard in the House Civil Rights and Judiciary Committee. That bill is an attempt to assert a scope of civil rights for individuals experiencing homelessness that's based on a recent court decision that provides some guidance on that front. And the premise of that is not concerning to us, but the way that the bill goes forward and implements that would essentially allow camping in public with very, very little restrictions anywhere that is a publicly owned facility that's otherwise open to the public. So inside of your city halls, your parks, your sidewalks, and it creates a really difficult set of authorities, essentially a right to sue jurisdictions for enforcing your laws that we think is incredibly overbroad. We would really appreciate your efforts to contact your legislators, especially if they sit on that House Civil Rights and Judiciary Committee, to let them know about the challenges with this bill. Another one that we're perhaps going to get some resolution to deals with the rights and responsibilities of cities as they interact with their faith institutions who host encampments, both indoor and outdoor, as well as associated with parking, people living in parking lots in their cars. Essentially, those activities are protected by federal law. It's an expression of religious faith, but there is, of course, an opportunity for cities to manage how they affect the surrounding community and ensure safety of the individuals who are staying at those camps. So there's a bill, 1754 and 5644, that we think is perhaps slanted a little bit too far in the other direction, but we're working with the proponents, and I think we may be able to get there on that one. I'll just end here with the culvert question. Candace mentioned the proposal that we've got to help focus public works resources on this challenge. I think you all know if the state were to only focus on their strict legal liability around culverts, they could spend billions of dollars, not get the fish any further, and then really shine a spotlight on local governments who do own the same sorts of infrastructure, but without support from the state. We're going to have a really hard time making the investments necessary to maximize that and actually achieve the salmon recovery goals that I think everybody agrees with. So we're making that case to legislators. I think we're making progress, but we would really benefit from your leadership from home to let them know that we need them to take a broader vision on this issue and not just focus on their own narrow legal liability. So if that's of interest to you, I'd love to talk to anybody who wants to get involved in that issue. And I think I will hand it over to Logan now and look forward to the questions later.
Good afternoon. I'm Logan Barr. I cover transportation, pensions, labor, personnel, as well as emergency management. I'd like to quickly take you through some of the bills on our hot sheet and then talk a little bit about some major transportation issues. And then if we have time, maybe we'll hit a few more transportation issues and some labor and personnel issues. So the first up is House Bill 1508 and Senate Bill 5521. Those bills seek to codify funding for the Transportation Improvement Board, the Freight Mobility Strategic Investment Board, and the County Road Administrative Board. Codify the funding that was provided in the last transportation package, which is known as Connecting Washington. These bills right now have been and are a technical fix. They were supposed to have this funding, have this codification in law when that package passed. There's a little bit of trouble right now in the Senate, so if you have a senator that sits on the Transportation Committee, reach out to them and let them know that you strongly support 5521. Next up, House Bill 1512. It's a bill that we also support. It would provide municipal electric utility and public utility districts the authority to offer incentive programs for the electrification of the transportation system. The bill would essentially put our utilities on par with investor-owned utilities. We're strongly supportive of it, and there's this standalone bill. There are also other larger, more omnibus energy bills, utility bills that have this policy incorporated into them. So I think that we're hopeful that we'll eventually see that this is enacted. Next up is a good little bill, 1695, with Representative Ramos. He's a freshman, and he is from the city family, and he's been really outstanding on this bill. It's a multi-year effort to provide a little bit of reform and a little bit of simplification. Really a good government bill. The bill would simplify local government pavement data reporting, and 1695 has actually been redropped today through discussions with Representative Ramos as well as other folks on the Transportation Committee. We're moving from a simplification to a repeal of this policy, which is very good news. And that bill is House Bill 2038, and we've had assurances from the Transportation Chair that it will move out of committee. So if you have representatives that are on the House Transportation Committee, please reach out to those folks and let them know that this is a good step forward in good government. Next up is Senate Bill 5789 and 1793 in the House. These are bills that we're supporting. They're known as Don't Block the Box, or the Block the Box bill. It would expand the use of city traffic cameras to cite drivers who stop within an intersection or crosswalk, illegally drive in transit-only lanes, or stop, block, or park in a zone restricted for law enforcement vehicles or public transit vehicles. It's one of Seattle's priority bills, and we think that it provides a great precedent for the use of these cameras statewide. I don't know if, I think there will be a substitute that will limit it to certain jurisdictions, but I think that it's good policy going forward. I've just been handed a reminder that please send in questions if you have them, and that email address that you can send us questions is questions@awcnet.org. That's awcnet.org. Moving on to moving on to actually the other side of the hot sheet on a bill that we oppose. House Bill 1390 And Senate Bill 5400, these are unfunded PERS 1 COLA bills. These are always pretty difficult to have to oppose, but if passed, it will cost local governments at least $16 million per year. And to put that into context, this would be on top of the approximately $60 million per year cities spend to pay down the PERS 1 unfunded liability. And to give you a greater context, state and local government in aggregate per year spend just over $1 billion to pay down those unfunded liabilities. So it's a very difficult argument. I can understand it from the other side. And we have been, I think, responsive to the concerns of the retiree groups. And our compromise or our proposal has always been, let's look at a policy that focuses on the retirees that need help the most instead of a straight 3% benefit increase. Why don't we really try to take care of the folks that need it most? So moving off of the hot sheet, there are a number of major transportation issues being discussed this session. First up is Initiative 976, or we can call it the return of the $30 car tab. The proposal would set annual license fees on motor vehicles at $30. It would repeal certain taxes and charges associated with regional transit authorities and ferry services. It would redefine the valuation that must be used in determining those fees to Kelley Blue Book, and it would also, for city purposes, it would repeal the authority for TBDs or transportation benefit districts to impose fees. If passed into law, this measure would have a significant impact on our state's transportation system. Initial fiscal estimates show that it will cost state and local governments over $700 million in the 1921 biennium and just under $800 million in the 21-23 biennium. Just looking at the potential loss for city transportation benefit districts, it would represent a loss of over $116 million per biennium. With an initiative to the legislature, there are a few options there are a few limited options that the legislature has to make. Essentially, they can pass it into law, in which case it becomes a law like any other bill. They can send it to the November ballot alone, or they can send it to the November ballot with an alternative or alternatives. So I would say rest assured that we have been involved in discussions with common stakeholders and transportation leaders in the legislature on how to best proceed. But we will continue to connect with you all to keep you updated on how this measure would impact your communities in ways that you can further engage. So I have a few more minutes. There's also a really exciting proposal that has been floated in the Senate by the Transportation Chair, Senator Hobbs, of a potential new revenue package for transportation. So right now it's in the conceptual phase. It hasn't been dropped as a bill yet, so there are a lot of unanswered questions, but I'll really quickly take you through kind of the broad strokes. And it would raise just over $17 billion in 10 years, and of the $17 billion, $500 million would be spent on maintenance, $1 billion on preservation, $3.1 billion on culvert replacement, which potentially would potentially include state and local culverts. And we're continuing to have discussions with the capital leaders as well as the transportation leaders about that policy. And the remainder of that would be used to fund projects throughout the state. And there are many different revenues attached to it, but namely there's a carbon tax, there's a gas tax increase, statewide transportation fees, and some nominal sales tax increases on certain things with a nexus to transportation. And I'd like to just quickly also touch on a large conversation that's been going on that particularly involves cities, having to do with access to and management of our rights of way. There is really a next step in our transportation system talking about micromobility or sort of first last mile of the transportation system, where there are new devices coming to market, and we're trying to understand in the policy context how to incorporate those safely into our current transportation system. So there are a few fascinating issues to be aware of, having to do with electric scooters, electric bikes, and the commercial entities that would manage those shared programs, as well as semi-autonomous delivery vehicles that would take material, take property, and deliver them from a truck or be location-based. And so, unfortunately, all these discussions raise the specter of preemption. So please, read our bulletin, get involved, have your cities look at these things with a critical eye, which is what we do. Rights of way are extremely important, extremely costly, and this discussion is not over and will only continue, I think, as these technologies improve. And how am I doing on time? Good. Okay. So I'll just touch on a few more things. We've been working. One of the nice things that I never get to talk about is our pensions and labor portfolio. We've really tried to take a different tack with the legislature this year and we've built kind of a coalition of public employers that we call creatively the Public Employer Work Group. And it's really a new effort to engage with our partners in labor, as well as labor leaders in the legislature, and our shared, our fellow public employers to engage with the policy discussion in a way that's distinct from all the other voices. We're not labor, we're not business, we're this third or fourth or fifth thing. And it's been, at this point, very successful. And we've gotten the PUDs, the ports, the school districts, the counties, and are looking to grow that group. So we're doing some good work on labor policy, as well as trying to ensure that the new Paid Family Medical Leave Act or program works well for all of our cities and all of our electeds. So with that, I am happy to turn it over to our newest lobbyist, Sharon.
Thank you. Let's see. Thank you, Logan. Hi, I'm Sharon Swanson, and I cover the public safety and the criminal justice portfolio. And I'm going to start off by talking about our legislative priorities and where we're at on those. First off is we have the Criminal Justice Training Center funding request, which is to move the current class size of 10 classes per year up to 19 classes per year. So that will help with the backlog that we have in the wait times. That funding was present in the governor's budget, which is the first budget to come out this year. So that was an extremely positive first step. Meeting with the chair of the Senate Ways and Means Committee and the House Appropriations Chair to make sure that we have that funding in both of their budgets, which will come out later in the session. And we are hearing very positive feedback from both of them that they recognize what a serious issue this is, and so we fully expect to see that. Second to the budget ask is a House Bill 1253. This is a policy bill that will reduce the wait times statutorily, which is currently 6 months, for a new recruit to receive training. Reduce that time down to 2 months. And that's a very important bill for us because, as you know, we need all the tools we can to address not only the backlog, but to ensure that moving forward we have adequate funding resources. So again, House Bill 1253 is currently in the House Appropriations Committee. It passed out of the Policy Committee unanimously, so that's a great sign, and we're working to make sure that gets a hearing. Next up, I want to talk to you a little bit about the co-responder program. That's the program that has behavioral health professionals riding along with law enforcement, so when they encounter someone in the community who is presenting as possibly having a behavioral health issue, the co-responder is there, and we can hopefully target those folks and not have them go into the criminal justice system. There is $3 million set aside as part of the True Blood settlement, which I will describe in a moment. And that is to allow the program to be implemented in Pierce County, Spokane County, and Southwest Washington. In addition, there was an additional $1 million in the governor's budget that will help WASPIC, the Washington Association of Police Chiefs, to implement the program and to grow that. So there's a total of $4 million dedicated to the co-responder program. We are continue to advocate for that program and see if possibly we can bump that number up, but certainly to ensure that at a minimum we walk away with $4 million for the co-responder program. Next, I want to talk to you about the opioid bills. Opioids is a issue confronting all of our cities, and you targeted that as a priority issue. There are two bills out there, Senate Bill 5380 and its companion, House Bill 1331. The Senate bill is currently in the Ways and Means Committee, so it has already moved past its policy committee. It's an expansive bill. We are favorable to just about everything in the bill. There is one area I want to highlight for you that is of concern, and we are monitoring that and continuing to work with the prime sponsor. And that's a requirement that by January 1st of 2021, city and county jails in Washington state have to adopt requirements to address the behavioral health needs of persons who are incarcerated and who are showing signs of having an opioid use disorder. So it's going to require that jails begin to implement what's called a medication-assisted treatment plan, also known as MAT. And so what we're doing is making sure that we have appropriate funding set aside so that when our local jails need to implement that, they have the proper resources to do so. Again, that's an ongoing conversation. I'm going to have that written up in the bulletin for you and continue to update you on our efforts to address the funding aspect of that requirement. And then the True Blood bills. True Blood, as most of you are probably aware, was a lawsuit that the state faced. They settled that lawsuit. It was in regard to not getting persons who are incarcerated mental health competency evaluations in a timely fashion. So when an individual is arrested and charged with a crime and they're showing signs of having either a mental health or behavioral health challenge, what we do with those folks is we send them out currently and have them evaluated to see if they are competent to address the charges that they're facing. There are timelines set in state law that require that we get them those services. We weren't meeting that as a state. The state was sued and the state settled. But in the meantime, they paid quite a lot in fines, and so the True Blood settlement takes some of the fines and lays out a path for how we need to address behavioral health in the state of Washington. And of course, that affects our city families. So we're looking at Senate Bill 5444 and its companion, which is House Bill 1513. Those are colloquially known as the True Blood settlement bills. We are in favor of those bills. We think those bills are addressing the needs as the cities face them. However, there is one issue, again, in the bill that we are working very hard on, and that is in regard to misdemeanors. Currently, an individual who is charged with a crime that is at the misdemeanor level, that person is eligible to receive inpatient competency restoration services. The bill would change that, and the bill would require that those individuals would need to receive outpatient services and that their charges would be dismissed. So the concern we have, and the concern I'm sure you're well aware of, is that not every region in the state has the robust outpatient behavioral health services in place at this time. And so we don't want to see those folks going out the door with nothing more than maybe an appointment card telling them where they need to be at a date in the future. Multiple reasons that is probably not going to work best for this particular population. So we are working with the prime sponsors. We're collaborating with the prosecuting attorneys, the counties, and the police chiefs to address this issue. And we will continue to update you on that. And so I want now to move away a little bit from our priority bills and talk to you about a few additional important pieces of legislation that I'm tracking. Wrongful death, Senate Bill 5163 and House Bill 1135. Many of you are probably quite familiar with this, but very briefly, wrongful death is a bill that will expand the classes of individuals who can sue in the event that a family member was killed. Currently, parents of adult children, that would be children over the age of 18, the children who are not married and do not have children of their own, those parents cannot sue. That's just the way the law is in the state of Washington. There are some parameters around that, but that's the gist of it. And what this bill would do is expand that class of individuals and say, regardless of the age of your loved one, your child, your adult child, you could sue for their wrongful death. And that hurts local governments because we have what's called joint and several liability, which means if we are 1% liable, 2% liable, we could end up paying 100% of the judgment if the other parties were insolvent and weren't able to pay. So we are fighting that bill. You've been fighting that bill for many years. We've had hearings in the policy committees. Both bills are now in their fiscal committees. And the unfortunate, I guess, climate at the legislature this year is it seems likely that there's a lot of support for this bill. We are working hard to try and get some amendments to mitigate the exposure for local governments. We're talking to the sponsors of the bill about possibly putting some caps on any types of judgments. We're talking about removing joint and several and getting proportional liability if we can. So there are ongoing conversations, very important bill. I would encourage all of you to reach out to your legislators. At some point, every member is going to have to vote for this or vote against it. So I would encourage you, Senate Bill 5163 and House Bill 1135, reach out to your elected officials in the legislature and talk to them about how this would impact your local government. We think it's a very bad bill. Next up is we have what's called the Indigent Defense Funding Bills, House Bill 1086 and Senate Bill 5098. These are bills that our friends at the counties are running, and these bills will require that over the course of 10 years that the state step in and pay for the indigent defense services that the counties and cities are providing. So it would be incremental over the course of a decade. The state would pay 10% more each year, and so that we, cities and counties, would be reimbursed for the costs. And as you know, cities spend approximately $40 million per year, and none of that is reimbursed. So we're extremely supportive of those bills, testified in favor, and we're working very hard to try and get those through the process. So those are Senate Bill 5098 and House Bill 1086. And finally, talking to you about House Bill 1767. This is another bill, sort of like the co-responder bill. This would allow grants for law enforcement agencies to develop processes for people who have been arrested. So this is a little bit further into the process. So folks who are not picked up on the co-responder process and diverted from incarceration, now they're arrested, now they're in jails, they're showing signs of having behavioral health challenges. This would put programs in the jails to allow folks to hook those individuals up with services so that we can possibly get them out of the jail and get them into some type of a supportive environment so they can address their issues. So those are the issues that we're primarily tracking, and I thank you and turn it over to Candace.
Thank you. I want to give a kudos to your AWC lobbying team. We've got a great group of folks, and they're covering a lot of issues, a lot of difficult ones, and doing a great job of representing cities in front of the legislature. I also want to encourage you to submit your questions. We have covered a handful of bills up here, maybe more than a handful, but we know that there are a lot of other issues out there that you may have questions about. So again, that email is on your screen at questions@awcnet.org. Send those in, and we will do our best to answer them. You can also obviously always connect with us. Our email information and contact information is on our website. And if you ever have a question about any bill or any issue before the legislature, please feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to answer those questions. And with that, I'm going to see if we have some questions from our audience.
All right. The first question is going to go to Logan. You're first up. You mentioned pavement condition reporting. And the question is, tell us more. What is wrong with the current requirements for pavement condition reporting? I know that at other organizations, we wish we had better metrics on pavement condition that could be used to help rank grant requests and have been frustrated by a lack of a common system. So changing the requirement does not sound like it's headed in the right direction, but obviously I don't know the details. Do you have comments?
I do have comments. Thanks for the question. I think, you know, the issue has been around for a number of years. There was a bill 2 or 3 years ago that was a straight repeal of the relevant statute. That ran into some problems in the House. There was a compromise that WashDOT would study that and then come back to the legislature with findings and recommendations. Many of their findings showed that at least this statutory requirement was redundant, and it was also inspecific in a way where the data that was reported was all different for jurisdictions. And so we've engaged with, when that law originally passed, it was in the early 2000s, and it was before a lot of the sort of capital asset management programs had gotten off the ground. And so I think we're in a better space in general in terms of understanding the condition of our pavement, and that statute was no longer relevant in a way that it may previously had been. And also the new bill that just dropped, and I'll find the number again, is a repeal, but it also requires WashDOT to continue to collect data that they're collecting right now as a requirement, that they're collecting because of a federal requirement. And even if that federal requirement were to go away, the pavement data on arterials that they collect now will continue in state law. So there's a repeal, but there's also a requirement that data continue to be collected. I will find that number of the new bill and read it off. It's House Bill 2038. It's Representative Ramos still. And if that answer doesn't suffice, please reach out to me. Thanks.
All right, the next couple of questions are for Carl about status on some issues. The first is we keep hearing about accessory dwelling unit bills, ADUs. Where is that issue?
Thank you. So for those of you who aren't well steeped in housing geekdom, ADUs or accessory dwelling units used to be called mother-in-law apartments. That's probably a more colloquial term for them. Essentially, the idea that is floating around the legislature is that is a sort of a soft density housing type that can be a way to increase housing options and supply to help address the affordability crisis that we're facing in a way that is perhaps less disruptive to existing neighborhoods, as something like bringing multifamily into a single family area, for instance. So largely cities would not disagree with that. There's a lot of cities who are telling me that they are aggressively pursuing ADUs or mother-in-laws apartments as a means to meet their population growth desires. And the benefit of that housing type is just that it can be moved into an existing neighborhood in a way that doesn't create a lot of disruption. The challenge is what we're seeing in the legislature is a bill that would basically remove almost all of the tools that cities can use to shape the way that ADUs are brought to your community. So cities that have height restrictions or requirements that they match the design of the existing neighborhood, setbacks for how close you can be to the property line, things like that. There is a proposal, and it's Senate Bill 5812 and House Bill 1797 that would essentially make all of those decisions for you and say you have to allow an attached ADU, which is basically one that's built into the existing home, and a detached ADU, which is a freestanding building in the backyard or somewhere on the parcel, on every single family lot in the community, whether or not you've got the infrastructure capacity to accommodate that, whether that meets your other goals in growth and that sort of thing, removes your ability to mandate or restrict height and deal with design and the other sorts of things that I mentioned. So we're really trying to work with the proponents of that to help them understand that we want ADUs, we want to help build more housing and a variety of housing types for our cities. But if you take away all of the ways that we can do that in a way that's comfortable and supportable by people who live in our cities, then that can be counterproductive and not something that we're interested in pursuing. So we've been having a lot of conversations with the advocates, with legislators, to try to find some middle ground approach that would work. And we're sort of halfway through that process right now, so I don't quite have a good sense of where that's going to end up. But that's the issue, and we're working pretty hard on it. So thank you for the question.
Okay, one more status question. This is on the issue of annexation and unincorporated islands. Is there a status update on that legislation?
Yeah, that has been a challenging conversation. We have had a desire to provide greater flexibility within the annexation laws of the state, and one of the active proposals was, with the leadership of the city of Lacey, is to make the existing island annexation process even more effective for you. So essentially that current process in law allows you for certain islands and areas that are in connection with your borders of a certain percentage to move forward with an expedited annexation, essentially, but it is subject to a public referendum. And the challenge that provision provides is that it introduces uncertainty and additional time and cost as you have to work with the affected communities. And essentially the challenge that a number of our cities are facing is you have these neighborhoods that are benefiting from city services. They might be driving on city streets, going to city parks, having their police and fire calls serviced by the city as opposed to the county, yet they don't pay for any of that. And the way that the current law is structured is essentially the decision about whether or not they come into a city is left up to those affected parties who have a natural sort of financial and self-interest in not doing that when they're receiving services that are not being paid for. And unfortunately, the rest of the city that is paying for that is sort of forced to subsidize those other parties. So City of Lacey has brought forward a bill that would allow that island annexation to move forward without a referendum opportunity. And it's run into a similar challenge that a lot of these proposals have had over the years, is legislators are very loath to take away the right of citizens to have a final say in these sorts of things. And there's not a groundswell of support to fix this sort of technical problem that faces local governments, especially in an arena where the passions on the other side from affected citizens can be very high. So unfortunately, that bill has kind of hung up. There's concerns from the policy committees that have yet to be overcome, and essentially it's about that referendum piece. What we did introduce was a separate proposal that would have required a interlocal agreement between the county and the city, so that if the county and the city both agreed on the borders and any revenue implications and the various things that come into play with an annexation, it could move forward without that referendum. That has had a little bit more of a positive reception from the same committees, but it is still waiting to move out of committee. So we're working on that. I don't want to leave you with the impression that that's an easy one, and that we're probably in a multi-year kind of effort around annexation reform. One final thing on that, we are hearing that the Ruckelshaus House process that was put in place a year or two ago to ask the state's Ruckelshaus House Center, which is a joint project between WSU and UW, to look at the growth management laws of the state after 30 plus years and see if there are any needs to improve that. And annexation reform is coming up consistently across the state, so I do think we're going to continue to have conversations about this in the coming years.
All right, this next question is for Candace. Has there been any progress on changes to bid limits for cities this session?
Thank you, Carl. That's a good question. There have been so many bills introduced around bid limits and public works contracting this session. Cities have had a bill introduced, Senate Bill 5618, that would increase bid limits for code cities and second-class cities. It would also increase the small works roster limit from $300,000 to $500,000. Also, a number of the other local governments out there have bills to increase their bid limits, fire districts, water sewer districts, PUDs, I think, as well. So there's been a whole host of bid limit legislation introduced. And the chair of the Senate Local Government Committee, Senator Tacko, is working on consolidating a lot of those increases into one bill and doing all of it sort of in one fell swoop instead of all of this piecemeal legislation. So we do anticipate that he will be introducing an amendment to one of those bid limit bills to roll all of these requests for increases up into it. And it would include an increase in bid limits for all cities, code cities, second class cities, and first class cities, with a pretty significant increase, maybe not as high as we would like, but something that is more reflective of today's dollar. The last time the bid limits were increased for some of our cities was about 10 years ago. So just with inflation, there's been significant growth in costs, and the bid limits haven't caught up to those or don't reflect what today's costs are. So I'm pretty optimistic that something will move out of the policy committee that will increase those bid limits for cities and provide us with more flexibility to do work in-house where we have the resources to do it. It doesn't eliminate our ability to go out to bid for those projects, but just provides us those opportunities to keep work in-house when we have the staff and resources to do it. The increase in the small works roster amount to $500,000 also, again, increases our flexibility to bid projects more quickly than going out to the full seal bid process. So look for that legislation to come out of the policy committee. There is opposition to it, however, from the building industry. Obviously, they would like to have more opportunity to go after these projects. So it's not just a slam dunk, but again, I think the bill will get out of policy committee, and we'll keep moving it through the process. Thanks for that question.
So this next question is for Logan, and it has to do with paid family medical leave in small cities. Is there an indication that changes will be made to the Paid Family Medical Leave Act to combine it into one of the other programs we already report on? Cities already have to do quarterly unemployment reporting to the state, which uses the same data for the Paid Family and Medical Leave Act. Any potential for complete opt-out from the program by small employers who don't want to participate in the program because they already provide leave, but maybe not at 12 weeks?
Good question. So this is really a new program. It passed 2 years ago. We've been through the rulemaking these last few years, and the premium collection started on January 1st. And so all the questions that have been lingering, those are really very important to start to answer now. Unfortunately, there are a lot of lingering questions. I'm getting told we need to be quick. So the question about similar reporting, I think that there is an opportunity to discuss that in the future. I don't know that that is on the table at this point, but I think it's valuable, and we'll continue to engage it with the agency to see how we can coordinate that reporting. On an opt-out, probably not. I would say definitely not at this point. But we have had discussions and are engaging pretty positive discussions with leaders in the legislature on PFML on how to potentially provide an opt-in provision for electeds, particularly for those small cities that where their employee count would bump them above and create a lot of administrative costs, as well as some difficulties in applying those job protections to electeds. So it's an ongoing discussion. We're really in the thick of it. So if you have an interest in paid family medical leave, please reach out. I would love to hear from you.
All right. So this next question is maybe to Candace, maybe to Sharon. You mentioned that the budget is likely to be released in mid-March after the revenue forecast. What key messages should cities be delivering to legislators about what cities want to see in the budget this biennium?
That is a good question, and maybe a good way to wrap up the question part of this live stream. So as I mentioned, the budget work will really start happening maybe in a few more weeks as we get closer to that March 20th revenue forecast. The governor did release his budget proposal back in December. For cities, our budget priorities are seeing that the legislature continues to honor our state shared revenues and that they continue to honor the distributions of liquor tax revenues, marijuana tax revenues, criminal justice assistance account revenues, all of those kind of shared revenues that we've historically had that relationship with the state on. So that's kind of first and foremost one of our priorities. We also want to see funding for the Public Works Trust Fund. Again, we talked about that at the beginning, the importance of continuing to fund that program, not create more diversions, and if possible, bringing some of those dollars back sooner and ending those diversions sooner. We've been talking about the need for the Criminal Justice Training Commission, as Sharon mentioned, and funding 19 classes a year for the Basic Law Enforcement Academy. That's a big priority for cities and generates a lot of costs for us if we're just having officers who aren't able to get into training in a timely fashion. There are a number of other issues like culverts and funding for the Fish Barrier Removal Board, which helps local governments with those culvert projects that get the fish farther downstream, as Carl mentioned. Streamlined sales tax mitigation is an issue for a number of our cities. The legislature voted to end the streamlined sales tax mitigation program this fall, September 2019. And for those cities who've been most negatively impacted by the change in how we collect sales tax in our state, it's important for those mitigation dollars to keep moving forward. We certainly are supportive of funding in the budget that helps with our affordable housing priority, particularly funding for the Housing Trust Fund and some of the other supported housing programs that are out there. So I could probably go on and list any number of additional priorities for the budget, but those are some of the big ones. And again, it's a bit early now, but it's definitely the time to be weighing with your legislators about the importance of these programs and ensuring that they are in the budget. It's the budget process, once the legislature engages with it, moves really quickly because they don't start it until later in session. They don't have a lot of time to make changes. So we need to be making these requests now and reinforcing that with the legislators. So thank you for that question. And I think that was our last question for this live stream. So I want to leave you with just a few to-dos. I've got 5 things that we're asking all of you in the audience today to follow up on. We certainly appreciate all the support that you give us and all of the work that you do at home, talking to your legislators and sharing these messages with your local legislators on behalf of the entire city family. So 5 things that I'm asking you to do today. Schedule a meeting or a phone call with your legislator. We know many of you wanted to be here in Olympia this week and that you had meetings scheduled and you would have connected with your legislator maybe at our annual reception or over dinner. Don't miss that opportunity. Go ahead and give them a call, see if you can schedule another time to talk with them, pass along your city priorities and AWC's priorities. If you can't get a meeting, go ahead and send an email with that same information. They are busy, but make sure to send an email and copy their legislative aide because they'll help make sure that message gets in front of their legislator. Check out our hot sheet. We talked about a number of bills that are on that hot sheet today and share those hot sheets with your legislator. That's something that we're going to be updating weekly and putting out in our legislative bulletin. Which brings me to another step that we want you to take, which is to read our legislative bulletin on a weekly basis. It's the best source for current information that we have. We put that out every Monday. And finally, one of the things we're asking that you do is find out when your legislator has their local town hall. A number of them will be scheduling either in-person or phone call town hall meetings. So go ahead, call their office, find out when that's being scheduled, and plan to attend. It's really important that they hear from you when they're back home, and those kind of interactions go a long way. Finally, I would like to remind you that AWC will be hosting Lobby Day on March 25th. Again, we were really disappointed that we couldn't have over 300 city officials in town this week, but obviously the weather didn't quite cooperate. So we do have another opportunity later in session on March 25th for our AWC Lobby Day, and you can register for that on our website right now. So thank you very much for participating and Talk to Your Lobbyist today. We're very grateful for those of you who tuned in. And I'd again like to thank your AWC lobbying team. They're doing a great job for you on the Hill. And we're looking forward to hearing more from all of our city officials. Thanks and have a great day.